At this time, too, we could not be happier to bring in our keynote speaker with you with the very latest from the field. Mr. Benjamin Perks is the renowned head of campaigns and advocacy in the Division of Global Communications and Advocacy at the United Nations Children's Fund in New York. Ben leads public and policy advocacy on issues related to the survival, development, and protection of children. He's a member of the Policy Advisory Group on the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, and is Senior Fellow at the Jubilee Center at the University of Birmingham in the UK, which researches education policy on character, social, and emotional development of children. He holds a master's degree in international relations from the University of Kent at Canterbury, recently completed the Harvard Graduate School of Education on Leadership and Education Reform Program. He is recognized as a public speaker, blogger, and influencer on violence against children and adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. If you have not viewed his TEDx talk or followed him on Twitter and his blog, you are missing out. You can connect with him from Center for Child Counseling's Lead the Fight webpage. Please join me right now in welcoming in Mr. Ben Perks. Ben, welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and it is truly a delight to join you and the Centre for Child Counselling. We're really impressed with the campaign and the work that you're doing in Palm Beach County. You're very much at the forefront of a growing global movement to end abuse and neglect for every child everywhere in the world. And this is very much aligned with our aspirations in the United Nations, UNICEF, World Health Organization, and other partner organizations. COVID-19 has, of course, been a turbo booster for every vulnerability, risk, and inequality in the lives of children and families. But as we look beyond the pandemic and to a hopeful recovery, perhaps it's time to really reimagine building a world without abuse and neglect. Intergenerational trauma is perhaps the most widespread and most costly, and yet least talked about social problem in our world. Intergenerational trauma plants itself early in the life cycle through what the Center for Disease Control and the World Health Organization call adverse childhood experiences, violence and abuse, neglect, and dysfunctional parenting. The seeds can be sown very early in childhood, and as scientists recently affirmed, even in the womb during pregnancy. First and foremost, adverse childhood experiences are a source of misery and anguish for the child in the moment that they occur. To paraphrase Stephen Porges, trauma is the disruption of connections, the connections that should be there for every child, the connections that protect and nurture us. Like literacy and numeracy, our capacity for relationships are built from the foundations up. It is sequential, and first base is a strong parental attachment. For children, safety is not just the absence of violence, it's the presence of love. When love is not there, the child interprets it as a threat and a risk, and it activates the stress response system if not soothed. This is something that Harvard Center for the Developing Child have called toxic stress, and toxic stress derails every aspect of child development. The way we are nurtured in early childhood determines our view of how lovable we are, how safe the world is, and how trustworthy others are. In most cases, it determines our view of those things for life. As babies, we are biologically programmed to nestle within the loving connection of a caregiver or parent. The connection is not a luxury, it's part of our evolutionary biology. We are dependent on adults for longer in the life cycle than any other species. We depend on them for three things: for love, for nurture, and for protection. We have a biological need to be loved, And that biological need doesn't set in when we're old enough to watch Love Actually or read Shakespeare. It's there from day one. When I think about love and how do you define it from a scientific perspective, the New York Times columnist David Brooks gave a really good definition of what love could mean. Love could be defined as the promotion and protection of another person's internal emotional world. Every child needs to have their inner world promoted and protected. Failure to promote and protect it is not always intentional. Parents who have grown up with emotional poverty themselves often just replicate automatically their own experiences. They think that's normal. As a British person in the United States, you constantly get asked about this stiff upper lip and the emotional coldness in things like The Crown and Downton Abbey, where emotional poverty sits alongside financial wealth. Emotional poverty occurs in a whole range of different contexts. It is a universal thing. And I honestly believe that in a more informed and enlightened era, historical sociologists will look, and social historians will look back at that stiff upper lip attitude and see it as a kind of a society's way of managing unprocessed trauma. Children don't come with a handbook, and parenting is largely automatic and instinctive. But what if our instincts are distorted by an early deficit of love? Could we support every parent in Palm Beach County and all over the world to overcome this, to learn parenting and to break that intergenerational cycle of trauma? Children ask 100 questions an hour, first by eye movement and by babbling, then pointing, and then with language. The response of the parent to those questions affirms attachment and enables language acquisition as the foundation for relationships and for learning. President Obama famously quoted the research suggests children in poverty or children affected by adversity hear literally millions less words by the time they arrive at primary or elementary school. At this early stage in life, the seeds of inequality are already being planted. This is the tragic early cost of poverty and adverse childhood experiences. At around the age of 3, children's questions switch from what and when to how and why. And this is the moment when they are very ready for a much broader network of connections through preschool, with peers and with teachers in moderately structured learning through play. Research from the Global PISA survey of over almost 60 countries shows that children do not go to preschool between 3 and 6, on average, are between 1 and 2 years behind in maths, science, and language at 15. And that contributes to intergenerational cycles of poverty. But it's also true that the more emotionally attuned and informed a parent is, the more likely they are to insist that their child goes to preschool. There are age appropriate relational milestones and building blocks that help humans evolve from babies to toddlers, from school children to amorous teenagers, to pair-bonded relationships, to parents and caregivers. Significant disruption to normal and healthy connections at any milestone or stage in that process are like a disease. They eat away at the potential for healthy development. The disruption causes anguish and pain and is contagious within families and across generations. A child deprived of healthy relations at home will struggle with relationships in preschool and school. That's because children who feel loved at home come to school to learn and to play, but children who don't feel loved at home come to school to be loved. And often they can express that need in the most unlovable of ways. And all too often, pre-K through 12 education systems are much less equipped to manage that than they should be. But we really know what a difference a great teacher can make. When COVID hit our universe, many people reached out to read the book The Plague by the Nobel Prize winning author Albert Camus. In fact, at the beginning of the pandemic, it topped many of the fiction reading lists and charts. Many people don't know that the Nobel Prize winning author was a victim of adverse childhood experiences, and it was a teacher that helped him to find a way through, who made a deep connection with him and supported him to continue with his studies when he was at risk of being enrolled by his impoverished family into child labor. Without that teacher, we would not have had one of the 20th century's greatest writers. And when Camus got his Nobel Prize, he dedicated to the teacher. And if you want to read the dedication letter, it is in one of his other books, The First Man. And if you can read it while keeping a dry eye, I'm very impressed. It's a very moving story of how transformative teachers can be in the lives of children faced by poverty and adversity. We know that when a child believes that they are held in the heart and mind of another human being, like a teacher, they may find a way through all of that adversity and find a way to build a better future and to break the intergenerational cycle of trauma. Despite being British, I did not grow up in Downton Abbey. I grew up in the bottom 1% in my country. I grew up in a children's home. I was a kind of a less good-looking, less intelligent version of Good Will Hunting as a young man. And I had no functional family, and I was a classic example in my neighborhood of somebody that would be recruited into gangs and very high level of risk. A teacher, Jan Report, saw something in me and became the first adult in my life who truly talked with me, listened, and made me believe I mattered as an individual. I would not be here with you today if it was not for Jan Reports. And I make a point of regularly contacting her and reminding her and thanking her for that. As the late teacher par excellence, Ruth Pearson said in her wonderful TED talk that you should all watch, every child needs a champion who'll be there for them no matter what, to form a deep connection and hold them up to the highest standards and help them to achieve those standards. We live in a world powered by the love of teachers, caregivers, and parents, but we all too often take that for granted and fail to invest in it. Connections with them are the vaccine against and the medicine for adverse childhood experiences and have the power to break intergenerational trauma. One question for colleagues in Palm Beach and elsewhere to go and think about, is it possible to ensure that in our community, every parent has support to parent, to be able to parent, and every child has at least one adult champion? We talked at the beginning about adverse childhood experiences. Broadly, they are 10 things: abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional or physical neglect, and household dysfunction, including witnessing addiction, crime, domestic violence, unmanaged, undiagnosed mental illness, and family breakup. We have recently learned that the higher the number of adverse childhood experiences, the greater the likelihood of broken lives in almost every area of well-being. ACEs adverse childhood experiences are the principal preventable cause of mental illness and addiction, and a contributor to obesity. They prevent learning, language acquisition, and diminish employment prospects. They increase likelihood of being a victim or perpetrator of violence or of being in prison. They also increase risk for non-communicable disease and undermine the capacity to form and maintain the type of relationships that can soothe trauma. When we see our friends or ourselves struggling with relationships, self-confidence, or agency, there are often underlying ACEs. Those with the greatest experience of childhood adversity, with 6 adverse childhood experiences or more, are found to have 20 years on average less life expectancy. Research from over 37 countries, Russia, Sri Lanka, many European countries, Saudi Arabia, many diverse and different types of countries show remarkably similar prevalence of adverse childhood experiences. On average, around 60% of any given population have had one adverse childhood experience, and somewhere around 15% have had 4 or more. The data correlates with other global data sets on related issues. UNICEF global research on physical punishment, Council of Europe research on child sex abuse. When we put these different data sets together, they tell an amazing similar story, and it's a global story. And this is not a new problem. The earliest ACE survey reflected children who'd grown up in the 1950s and 60s and found then that 63% of respondents had 1 ACE and 12.5 had 4 or more. So it's not a new problem. It's a long-standing problem. It may have been much worse in the past, but it's something we're only beginning to shine the light on now through evidence and research and science. Those with 4 or more ACEs are at significantly higher risk for smoking, heavy alcohol use, cancer, heart disease, respiratory disease, and at much stronger risk for things like sexual risk-taking, mental illness, ill health, and addiction. ACEs are a substantial but largely hidden contribution to the World Health Organization global burden of disease estimates, which is the way we calculate disease and illness throughout the world. And listen to this, in North America and Europe alone, just the health outcome costs of ACEs are 1.3 trillion annually. They could be prevented for just a fraction of that cost. ACEs are not only a public health and addiction issue, they're also a criminal justice and a national security issue. Research from the health system in Wales in the United Kingdom shows that somebody who has had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences is 14 times more likely to be a victim of violence and 15 times more likely to be a perpetrator. In one of the strongest pieces of evidence about the link between adverse childhood experiences and intergenerational cycles of violence. I doubt that Ghislaine Maxwell, Osama bin Laden, Pablo Escobar, and David Duke would have understood the language or the science of ACEs, but all of their empires and enterprises are built on the back of adverse childhood experiences. Groomers, terrorists, gangsters, and violent extremists are laser focused on identifying, targeting, and exploiting the most vulnerable teenagers. They reel them in with the promise of belonging and reward. They choose children who are already in pain, those who feel unloved or unworthy, those affected by violence. Criminal groups can sense their vulnerabilities the way top banks and law firms sense Ivy League and breeding. An investigator described how Jeffrey Epstein did this. In quotations, he created a very solid spider web of girls whose vulnerabilities he could prey on, many of whom had adversity at home and were always on the edge of homelessness. 2/3 of white supremacist group members in a survey in the US had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, compared to just 16% of the US population overall. A study on ISIS recruitment in Northern Macedonia said that every single teacher without exception said the main determinant of who would be recruited by ISIS to go to Syria or to Iraq was that their parents one didn't care about them, had a lack of care and a lack of love for the children. In London, the average person who delivers drugs is 17 or under and has an ACE score of 4 or more. To be clear, most people with high ACEs are not trafficked, radicalized, or recruited by the mafia, but the risk factor is elevated dramatically. And this is also another question I'd like to ask all of the participants on the event. Is the community that you live in doing more to exploit the children who are vulnerable, or doing more to protect them? The world is waking up to a global conversation about adverse childhood experiences. And it reminds me of something that James Baldwin said about literature. He said, you think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read, the things that tormented me the most were the very thing that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive. And this is the awakening and kind of the comfort that many people are finding in the ACE conversation. They're finding an explanation and an understanding of their own experience, of the ghosts that sometimes haunt them in their family's past, and how they can break that cycle for the next generation. When I tell policymakers, parliamentarians, presidents that more than half of humanity experience some form of ACE, and up to a third experience significant ACEs, they look in disbelief. And I can sympathize, because I spent most of my life believing the neglect and violence that I'd experienced in my childhood was marginal and on the fringes of society. But we all see in the media and culture the detached James Bond, the insecure Bridget Jones. We see trauma in the songs of Amy Winehouse, in the plot lines of Tolstoy and Dickens, of Hugo and Victor Hugo, the stories of Elton John, of Oprah Winfrey, of Billy Connolly. Why would we be so surprised that adverse childhood experiences and intergenerational trauma are so widespread? Most people affected by intergenerational trauma are perhaps not consciously aware of it. For many, the seeds were planted in the earliest part of life, beyond the range of memory that can be retrieved verbally. It distorted the expectations of what would follow thereafter and how life should be. There is also a mutually reinforcing and little understood relationship with historical trauma, from slavery, from the Holocaust, from apartheid, conflict and famine, that plays in and works alongside adverse childhood experiences. Intergenerational trauma came to be understood as life as it was meant to be lived. As Galit Atlas has said, everything we don't know about ourselves has the power to control and run our lives, in the same way the riptides below the surface of the ocean are its most powerful force. Most people whose lives are shaped by trauma have never had a conversation about trauma, and we need to change that. Our inability to talk about our own trauma renders us strangers to ourselves and to each other. We need a public conversation that does three things: removes judgment, stigma, and shame, demystifies the issue of trauma and adversity, and provides literacy and numeracy on it. And thirdly, focuses on the solutions and the connections that we need to have. So what are some of the solutions? There are many, but in the United Nations, at the moment, we are focusing on really 4. The first one is to try to treat parenting programs that give a basic package of guidance and support on parenting and affirm attachment and skills, to treat them like a vaccine that should be available to every parent in the world. That we know from randomized control sites, trials in over 200 locations in the world, that they have a huge impact in improving outcomes, attachment, and preventing violence against children. And we know that James Heckman, the Nobel Prize winning economist from the University of Chicago, has estimated that every dollar that we invest in programs like that, we get an up to a $13 return on that investment through improved life outcomes. The second thing we need to do is to ensure every child has a champion in school. Relationships with teachers and friends are a really important factor against ACEs, and they need to be central to our teacher recruitment, training, and school governance and ethos. They are essential for learning. Children who are in a state of toxic stress cannot learn. Every child should attend a school where they feel connected, respected, known, and soothed. We need to have a conversation in every single community, everywhere, and to break that taboo and recognize that whoever we're speaking to could be affected by and living with trauma. And we need to have conversations that are relevant to the local cultural context. Only through conversation can we turn the ghosts of trauma into ancestors that we can understand. And finally, we need to have a more realistic understanding of the economics of adverse childhood experiences. Trillions of dollars annually are lost, and could be prevented. They cost the public purse trillions annually and could be prevented for a fraction of that cost. Ministries of finance should analyze the costs of childhood adversity on health, well-being, crime, violence, and addiction, and adjust government budgets to focus on prevention and response. There are so many other things that can contribute to reducing adverse childhood experiences. In America, the richest country on the planet, we have a real problem with parental leave, which is a key issue for prevention of ACEs and strengthening childhood attachment. We also need to ensure that we have universal access for every 3 to 6 year old to preschool education. We need family-friendly and trauma-informed workplaces. These are all things, the 4 things that I mentioned as our priorities are things that we're really focusing on in low and middle income countries, but wealthy countries like America can do much, much more. I just want to say that whenever I tell people that we want to end abuse and neglect in the world, they often look at us as if we're crazy. But we think we have some good historical lessons to draw on in all of this, and we think that it's very doable. We need to address child trauma and adverse childhood experiences in the way we have tried to address COVID-19, to make sure that everybody knows about the risk, that we interrupt transmission through prevention, and that we ensure recovery through timely response. When I get pushback more recently on my passionate belief that we can end abuse and neglect, I think of the really selfless comments of the bereaved father and US Congressman Jamie Raskin, who reminded us that most parents that have ever been have witnessed the death of a child. We forget that the robust prevention of childhood mortality through vaccines and other public health measures is relatively new. In the 1980s, 3 things happened. Global vaccination coverage of under 5s against the major childhood diseases increased from 20% coverage of children in the world to 80%. What followed was that child mortality reduced by 61%, and the world stopped being a place where it was acceptable that children would die from preventable disease. We no longer saw that as inevitable. Could we honor those public health pioneers by ourselves being the generation that brings us to the point where intergenerational trauma and adverse childhood experiences are no longer seen as inevitable or unpreventable? Maya Angelou said, "There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." Together, we can end that agony for every child. We can end abuse and neglect and build a world truly fit for every child everywhere. Thank you.